welcome back to the channel. My name is Lindy Jung. I am a sci-fi and fantasy author, and I talk about writing, books, travel, and pretty much whatever else I feel like on here. So we are finally back with part 4 of my fantasy world building series. Part 1 covered the basics, the essentials that you need to know before you start building a fantasy world. Part 2 covered ecology, history, and geography, and part 3 covered culture, identity, and language. I will link those below and in the little pop-up thing right here if you want to check those out, but really these don't need to be watched in order at all. Honestly, if you're going through the steps of building a fantasy world by following these videos, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that. My first and biggest piece of advice is always to pick and choose the elements of fantasy world building that will apply to your story, to your plot, and your characters. That should be the centerpiece of any book that you're going to write. Of course, if you're doing something like, I don't know, building a world for your D&D campaign, or trying to get a cat to not climb on you like you're a tree, I'm gonna put him outside. 1 second. But basically there are a ton of different applications for these world building skills. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys today about, and these aspects of world building, I will admit, are not my strongest. I don't think I've written any very politically heavy fantasy books. I mean, I know I haven't. So it's definitely sort of a challenge for me, which is also why this video took so long. But this week we're going to be talking about fantasy politics, economics, and daily life. So my little disclaimer here is that every part of this series is a relatively light overview of the topics at hand. I'm really just going over the basic building blocks you would need to start really developing your world and your ideas. I mean, the possibilities in fantasy are just so endless that it would take hours and hours to cover every topic even slightly thoroughly. Also, I kind of just find it fun and interesting to talk about these things, especially the more niche subjects that people might not necessarily think consciously about when they're building their fantasy worlds. The rule of thumb on this channel for all writing advice or writing tips or anything of that nature is that prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds. Everything that I lay out here is not necessarily meant to be taken straight. If you feel like these tips don't apply to you, to your story, to your world, then there's no reason for you to follow them. I'm hoping to just maybe spark some inspiration or maybe help you find a piece that you overlooked or didn't realize was missing. And again, this particularly is an area of fantasy world building that I am not super experienced or familiar with, although I did have a lot of fun learning about it, so, you know, it was a win for me. So let's just jump right into it with the first topic of the day. This is going to be politics. The goal here is to basically create systems of government or lack thereof for your world. If you have already started building up your world's history, ecology, just sort of the basic building blocks for it, you probably have nations or kingdoms or other types of dumbs, I guess. And those parcels of land or people or whatever else most likely have some sort of governing body or system in place. The intent or purpose behind creating politics for a fantasy world, other than a lot of very hard fantasy books rely very heavily on the political aspect of their world to build their story and to build their conflict, is to create internal logic. This is again harkening back to that suspension of disbelief that we talked about a lot in the previous videos. You want the world to make sense. You want it to not necessarily be fully recognizable to the modern reader, but to have its own internal logic. And I think that a governing body that lays out taxes, laws, whatever else governments do, honestly, not that much, that is going to create a system for your world that makes sense, hopefully, and is very logical and keeps things in their place, more or less, and ties it all together. If you have a large-scale fantasy world, I'm talking about multiple nations, multiple continents, and international relations are a thing, politics are going to sort of lend logic to the relationships between those different powers. Ideally, they'd have different types of political systems and ideologies, so they might come into conflict, they might have allies, wars might be a thing, we'll talk about wars a little bit. And finally, politics can provide a lot of intrigue and create macro-level conflict for your world. Most of the macro-level conflict that takes place in fantasy worlds is going to be political in nature. Maybe not most, a good chunk of it. If you're thinking about wars, if you're thinking about succession battles, if you're thinking about any sort of persecution or oppression from a higher body, then that is all politics. The third section I usually talk about here is what a story looks like without it. And it actually sort of doesn't apply here because a story can absolutely exist in the fantasy or sci-fi genre with zero consideration of its world's politics. Cozy fantasy very rarely, I feel like, we'll have to consider politics. Anything that's very character focused or just smaller scale, very, very focused on like an individual or a small group of people, these stories are probably not going to deal very heavily with their politics. But of course you have the other side of the spectrum, which is hard epic fantasy, hard political fantasy, which is going to rely heavily on its politics and will therefore require a lot of thought when developing the political system of its nation or nations. Because if you hinge your conflict off of politics, but your politics at a baseline don't really make sense or are kind of haphazardly done, then that conflict is not going to be satisfying. But let's talk about the mid-ground. Just like your average fantasy, it takes place maybe in 1 or 2 nations, maybe it's a quest, maybe there are different types of political systems scattered throughout the various locations that the characters visit. I see this quite often. I also see it a lot, I feel like, especially in stories that are set in worlds with a monarchy. I think people forget that a monarchy is a political system. Kings are not just rich people wearing crowns, they are in charge of their nation. Most of the time. Sometimes they're figureheads, that's another thing. They have some sort of relationship with their political system because their political system is the monarchy. And honestly, one of my biggest pet peeves is 1, fantasy that doesn't critique monarchies, and also 2, fantasy that establishes a monarchy or an oligarchy or some sort of similar, sort of like tyrannical, one person, one rule political system and doesn't even really consider it a political system. Another big issue I have is like law enforcement in fantasy that doesn't have some sort of directive or body that is in charge of it, like knights that are just kind of wandering around. Like, who do they answer to? What is their job really, and what is their role in the society? When were they first established? You don't have to necessarily go into all these details, but it's good to sort of understand where these things are coming from. In modern fantasy, these sort of like, especially kings and knights, they've been tropified beyond their existing historical roles, and that's well and fine, but I just think that personally, and maybe for a lot of other people too, it just is more satisfying to see that the author has really thought through these things and has included them for a reason and not just because, hey, it's a fantasy story, so there needs to be a king. So even if you're writing a sort of lighter fantasy book, there is definitely room for you to consider the politics of your world and sort of create this internal logic for yourself. You know, make the world a little bit more well thought out, a little bit more fleshed out, allow for that suspension of disbelief on the reader's part. And this is coming from someone who doesn't necessarily even enjoy heavy politics in their fantasy. Now that that's all said and done, how do we actually go about building a political system in a fantasy world? So I've sort of broken this down into very, very like basic steps. And step 1 is going to be deciding on what system or systems of government you want to use in your world. So there are far more types of government than just monarchy and democracy. I actually found a really extensive list of the 36 different types of political systems, and I have linked these below. These include both real and imagined types of government. This list is geared toward fantasy writers, and they don't go too in-depth into each type of system that they list, but it would be a really good jumping off point, I think. You can get an overview of what types of systems there are or have been thought up, and then you can sort of like research from there. But I'm also going to just sort of like walk through 2 examples real quick. Example number 1 would be anarchy. Anarchy describes the complete lack of centralized government or rule. People are just sort of running around, no one's overseeing them. So this can apply to individuals. An individual person can be an anarchist, or this can also apply to a whole society or country even. Although I feel like a country that has fully descended into anarchy might not be viewed as a good thing and might be sort of a hard time. Societal anarchy in a fantasy world would be one that has just no authoritative figures, or if authority is present, that it's largely ignored by most people. So this would be maybe like a bandit country. There's no laws, there's no leaders. People have maybe like sort of descended into like little roving groups of bandits and are just like stealing from each other and creating chaos. Maybe in the larger scheme of this fake world, the countries around this little like pocket of banditry are very much like, please don't go there. We've just sort of cordoned it off like it's the purge because we cannot be handling this right now. Because there's no like centralized currency, or currency is just really unstable, bartering system is going to be sort of the main way that people get things, or just stealing. You know, it's a bandit country. So obviously this is a very difficult life and people probably don't live very long, but it's also very freeing. So maybe people who've been ostracized by their very nice, neat, tidy democratic societies are coming over here, sort of adopting this bandit lifestyle because they have nowhere else to go, nowhere else to turn at this point. It's like a last resort. There could also be a positive aspect here where maybe if you have faced societal oppression and it's really unfair, maybe for being like a minority or queer or something else, then you might find this bandit country really appealing and you might immigrate here as well. So there would sort of be a balance of these like lawless people who just don't have anywhere else to go because they've done too many crimes or whatever, and also like people who are generally pretty decent but have been unjustly persecuted for something out of their control. So that could be like a really interesting take on anarchy, I feel like, in that, yeah, I mean, not having a stable currency or like laws that keep people in check might be really, really negative and like sort of a stressful experience, but also that sort of freedom is completely unparalleled in the rest of the world. My second example is aristocracy. In an aristocracy, it is the rule of the few, typically with lots of money and power. Usually these aristocrats don't really do anything to earn their position. They're just born into the right family at the right time. They are the ruling class. It's these rich people, usually out of touch. They're probably hoarding a lot of resources. It kind of sucks. In a fantasy world, one thing that you could really focus on here that might make a great theme would be this class divide, this sense that there's like a handful of people who just have all the land, all the money, all of the goods, all of the resources they could possibly need. They're developing more, they're expanding their wealth, and all of this is on the backs of the working class and the lower classes. So obviously a political conflict that could come into play here is this class warfare. The lower classes are going to get fed up. They're going to see that these people are full of shit. They're going to realize that they've been working their backs off to make the bare minimum, while most of their labor and most of their production goes to directly benefit these like rich overlords who are giving them absolutely nothing. There's no robust middle class. There's no way to sort of claw your way up the ladder of success to build a better life for yourself. You are born into your station and you will die in your station. Some people are going to take issue with this. Step number 2 is to divvy up your systems. If you are doing a lot of heavy lifting in regards to politics for your fantasy world, you probably have a big fantasy world. I'm just gonna hazard a guess and say that you have multiple countries. You probably have considered like colonialism, imperialism, and like all this history, and you're going to want to give different systems to different nations. This feels really obvious, but I want to go a little deeper and consider elements of how political systems come to be. With most modern political systems, they have sort of sprung up from the ideas of a couple of thinkers, or maybe one or two. They develop from there. They're applied in a certain way. If you're doing large-scale fantasy world building and coming up with political systems for multiple nations or groups, then I want you to consider what sort of like the baseline original political system or system of governance would have been in this world. Like when we think about pre-political history, before these were established by a certain sect or group of people, were there like singular leaders of small family groups, or were there kings, or were there other types of rulers, or were there like bodies of elders who make decisions, or religious figures? And sort of go from there. I think it's really important to consider the roots of systems and like how they come to be. America, for all its flaws, was founded on this very like idealistic vision of a non-monarchy system with no kings, no singular rulers. That idea came from somewhere. Another thing to consider is how people react to their neighbors and to history as it occurs. I don't know if that makes sense, but basically if a certain country forms a democratic republic and it goes really well, then the countries around it might also be inclined to adapt similar or the same systems. But if a singular country has like an oligarchy and it's really tyrannical and like very upsetting to the people who live there, and the other countries are in the know, they probably are not gonna want to do anything like that. Some countries might be really stuck in their ways, and this could be a cultural thing. Some countries might be more inclined toward tribalism. Their geography is so broad that there's like really no feasible way with the technology of this world to maintain and run a centralized government. Some countries might just not want a centralized government. Maybe independence is a really big thing for them culturally. Maybe keeping decisions and stuff like that to the family group instead of to the nation. Another thing to consider would be if you're writing something like an aristocracy or a monarchy, then where do those families come from? How did they rise to power? How do they maintain that power? It's such an obviously unfair system to so many people, and they have the numbers disadvantage most of the time, if not all of the time, that like, why haven't people risen up against them in the past? One way that this has been accomplished historically is that these, ruling families or ruling groups would create a sort of myth around themselves. Oh, this king is descended from the gods, so they have like a right to religious rule. Even if they don't necessarily have any like actual religious role in the society, they're viewed through a religious lens by like a very religious group of people. Maybe the actual religious body, like the church or the priests or the shamans or whoever, are like maintaining this lie. They benefit from it through some relationship with the monarchy, so they're just spreading this, dispersing the propaganda as much as possible. Just thinking about the relationships between different political systems and ideologies and where they might come from and history. It's a really big rabbit hole, but I think it's one that's worth falling into. Step number 3 is to figure out who's who in your political system. So this just means determining your key players, especially in the context of your world, who is in charge, who is at large, etc. in the world as it stands now. Key players could be kings, queens, other monarchs, the ruling leaders of the oligarchy, ruling members of the aristocracy or ruling houses, or like the scholars and religious figures who maybe pull the strings from the shadows. Figure out who's in power for real, who's the like visual forefront of the governing system, maybe who's fighting back or rebelling, maybe whose ideologies are trying to shape the system into something new. I think something that we forget is that politics are pure human invention. They come from people, they're maintained by people, and the maintenance is not easy. So if a system has been put into place and people are working very hard to maintain it, how are they benefiting personally? I feel like faceless political systems also, they work. It just, you have to justify it really well. Like there has to be a reason, because I do think that people do not trust these systems inherently, because I mean, why would you? It's just more comforting, even if it's a false sense of comfort, to know who is in charge. Step number 4 is to consider sources of political conflict. This is the fun part. Politics are a breeding ground for conflict on so many levels, from individual to like world wars. So like individual people might conflict over each other's differing worldviews. The system itself might create conflict by oppressing certain liberties or types of people. Rebels could rise up to take down an oppressive system or fight the power. Politicians could conflict over the best or worst ways to govern people, or maybe extract resources or handle international relations. Different nations may conflict over political beliefs or ideologies or religious beliefs, or pretty much anything. Or multiple governing bodies or nations could unite on opposing political axes and start international multi-nation conflicts. Definitely, you don't have to include every type of conflict I just listed to make your world rich or interesting. These are just ideas for different sources of political conflict. Because politics are they just create so much conflict. Even if the conflict isn't like the main conflict in your story, it could be good to include just to make it feel more real and grounded and like an actual system that people have opinions about, because they always do, because it's a huge part of your life. A little note here about wars, which I honestly might do an entire separate video about, because this is something I did not dive as deeply into as I was expecting to this time around. War is costly, it is time consuming, it has a serious effect on everyone involved and people who are not involved. So it is really important to ensure that the root of your conflict makes sense. Even if it's not like necessarily the most logical decision to go to war over this, it has to be something that would like cause enough problems for war to be justified, if that makes sense. I get really frustrated when I see like senseless war. Oh god, this one is so common. War that's been going on so long that people forgot why it started. Like there has to be sense to it. And I will say that I really don't enjoy military fantasy. I just basically don't really like any fantasy story with a war in it. That's just my personal preference, but it is a big part of fantasy. Most of the like large scale secondary world fantasy books, especially the ones that are very popular, they include some sort of like military conflict. And when it comes to depictions of the military and of military conflict, especially like international military conflict, I feel like it's very important to know what your perspective on your military in the real world is. I'm not going to talk too much about what I think now. I don't think war is necessary almost ever. I feel like I can leave it at that. Again, with the political systems, your biases are going to come into play. I will talk about this a little bit more later, but just be aware of like where you come from. None of us exist in a bubble. We are all influenced by the world we live in and what media we've consumed growing up, and it's tricky to navigate, but I think that there is a real issue with how American writers are depicting war and military conflict in fantasy. I don't think that most of these people are setting out to write like pro-war propaganda. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that it's just important to know that we have a very specific viewpoint as Americans or Westerners at large, and that just being aware of that will definitely help you at least think differently about what you're putting on the page, if nothing else. Now that we've talked about that, one more note: propaganda is a political tool. It is far more widespread than I like to think about. I think propaganda in fantasy is something that is very interesting. It would be interesting to think about propaganda dispersal. This is again a huge undertaking, but if you're writing a war, propaganda is going to be part of it. That's basically it. Think about propaganda. Part 2 is economics. The goal here is to create a system through which trade and currency are regulated and conducted, and how wealth is distributed. So again, the purpose here is to create more internal logic for your world. Trade and currency and those things are also a really strong potential source of large-scale conflict. I think a greater global understanding of what resources may or may not be available could also create smaller scale conflict for your characters. Like this could be a huge obstacle, that weaponry is really expensive and hard to come by. Economics is definitely like a C tier world building thing, but I do think it is an important sublayer, especially if you're writing a very political fantasy. This is something that I don't know anything about. I don't know anything about economics. I still don't really know, but I tried to like learn the bare basics and thought a little bit about how I might apply these to a fantasy world. This is all again about suspension of disbelief, internal logic, giving yourself the building blocks to create a logical, meaningful conflict in the world, or not. Maybe you just want to do economics for fun. I don't know why, but more power to you. So I'm going to start with a broad overview of the common types of economic systems. I took AP Econ in high school, and honestly, like, I don't know how I got through it because none of these sounded familiar to me. The first broad type is the market economy. This is based off of supply and demand. Supply and demand determine the value of goods in the market. This is going to be the most familiar type of economic system for like me and you. What was interesting to me is that market economies are not actually governed. Supply and demand are what run the economy, which is kind of weird. Next is a gift economy. This is like a system that was more commonplace in like earlier civilizations especially. So this includes gift systems and barter systems, and I'd actually never heard of gift systems before. These are both not based off of any type of currency. You sort of give and receive on like the honor system. So the gift system works best in a close-knit community. You're going to your neighbor, Roger, and saying, here's 10 carrots, enjoy. And then maybe like a week or two later, Roger's like, here's 10 potatoes, enjoy. And you're sort of not really keeping tabs, but just sort of giving your excess to the people around you, especially fulfilling their needs without really expecting anything in return, just feeling comfort in the knowledge that they will also take care of you when needed. What's interesting about a gift system is that social norms are actually sort of gonna silently govern these systems. No one's actually telling the value of so-and-so goods that you've given Roger over the past like year or so. But if a year has gone by and Roger hasn't given anything to you and he has the means, like he is producing plenty of milk, but he's just hoarding the milk for some reason, then he might face social ostracization, and you could start giving your carrots to Rebecca, who gives you lovely textiles in exchange. So there's like this sense of equilibrium, of balance, and also just that the community is there for each other and helping each other out. Obviously there are flaws in this, like it could only really work in a relatively small group of people, and you might not always get what you need or what you want, but if you're able to put your trust in your community and the people around you and they're able to do the same, then it would more or less work out over time. The third type of general economy is a centrally planned economy. So this is an economy that is governed by some sort of like outside body. So this government or ruling body is going to regulate production and distribution of goods. This is the type of economic system that's associated with socialism and communism. There's a focus on social welfare, so people always are going to get what they need, or more or less always get what they need, and economic efficiency, because the government is able to oversee everything that's happening in the economy. But then of course, because there's no free trade really, this can be a pretty restrictive system, and there's a lot of other things we can get into, but I won't. The next topic I want to cover is currency. So currency's value is completely arbitrary, so you can just make up whatever you want. Things to consider could be like the physical form of currency. Are people, distributing paper or fabric bills, metal coins, stone coins, beads, IOUs? Think about where currency's value is sourced from. Is it a community that's agreed like, okay, one bead is half a loaf of bread, and that's just what one bead is worth, and that's what we're gonna do, and that's what we're gonna follow? Or is the value determined by a centralized treasury or other sort of like government agency that just handles this sort of thing? And what is the public's level of faith in the currency? And then finally, one thing you want to probably figure out and just like write down some math for is the relative value of the currency in your world. I think this can be a little bit weird to handle, and you would have to think about supply and demand. For example, if one coin is a loaf of bread and then 2 coins is a basket of eggs, but 3 coins is half a basket of duck eggs, because duck eggs are a little bit rarer than regular chicken eggs. Sort of figure out that math and just stick to it. It doesn't have to completely make sense, but as long as you are consistent with it, then I think it's fine. God, okay, more economics, let's go. So next I want to talk about wants versus needs and the allocation of resources. God, I just heard myself. That's so weird. First, we have to define what a commodity is, and unfortunately, a commodity can be literally anything. The rule of supply and demand dictates that the scarcer and more necessary a good or a service is, the more value it obtains. If you're in the desert and all of the fresh water in this vast desert is maintained and distributed by a single group of people, then they can set whatever price they want because it's a necessity. People will basically pay whatever they can to get this fresh water at risk of death. But if you're in the desert and someone is selling fur coats, then I mean, you're probably going to get a really good deal on a fur coat. So back to my freshwater example, this is sort of how monopolies arise. This is how monopolies arise. Someone or a group of people identifies a need or a very, very high value want in their community. They just take all that and then they can set whatever price they want and become fucking rich. This is another way that the few control the many, by controlling their necessities, just by creating this like false scarcity. But it is a really interesting source of economic tension. Class stratification as a result of resource allocation, people fighting or scrabbling over these resources, trying to seize them for themselves. These are all different sources of conflict that you could include in your story. All right. Done with economics, let's go to part 3, daily life. So the goal here is to determine what daily life looks like for the average Joe in your world. I kind of was like, why am I including this? But I think it's important. So the purpose of figuring out the daily life of an average citizen in your world is to ground this world in reality. A lot of fantasy stories, of course, we want to focus on the interesting people, like the kings and the queens and the bandits and the Robin Hoods and whatever else. But just understanding what the average person goes through living in this world, I feel like will help you gain so much perspective on the kind of system you've set up. Because when we focus on the extremes and the extreme lives in these worlds, then we often sort of forget how ridiculous the world is becoming. This is also a great way to sort of figure out what you're missing, like fill in the small cultural details, like where do people gather, what sort of jobs do people have, what sort of clothes do they wear, what sort of family units do they live in, maybe like where people obtain food or water if they're not rolling in dough. I think it's just a really good exercise. You could do this as a short story or just like map out the basics of some guy named Joe or anyone, a lady named Joe, in this world. So I'm just gonna like zoom through this list of areas of daily life that you could consider when coming up with this. The main one is going to be acquisition of resources essential to survival, such as like water, food, clothing, sleep. Are they able to sleep safely in like a tent or a house? Are they homeowners or do they like have communal living? Are there like bunk houses? What's going on? Food culture, so how many meals a day are typical for the average person? What type of food is commonplace or easy to obtain? Are there any cultural dishes? Do people usually like cook for themselves or eat out? Or is there like street food or communal dining within the community? Next point is, what is the most common or dominant religion? How might this affect daily practices? Are there any daily rituals that need to be done? How widespread is this religion? Are most people Orthodox or are they more casual? Next would be jobs and life in the workforce. What is the most common labor requirement in this world? Like, what is the thing that keeps the world running? What kind of person fulfills this niche? How much do they make? Do they like their job? Is it causing them any sort of stress? Are there maybe environmental conditions that could be leading to health problems? Mining is a big one. Mining causes a lot of health problems, especially like the longer someone's been working in the mines. Another thing to consider is downtime, or what people might do with their free time. The amount of downtime will generally vary across economic classes, and the types of activities people pick up to fill that downtime could be very different as well. Someone who is artistically inclined but rich might paint with oil paints. Someone who's artistically inclined but maybe more working class might just do like graphite sketches or charcoal sketches, maybe even like wall murals or something like that. Another thing would be societal norms, manners, how people interact with each other. Do they greet each other in the morning? Do they talk to their neighbors and are friendly, or is it just more of like a closed off individualistic thing? Big one here, because we talked about politics and economics today. You want to think about the effect of politics and economics on the working and lower classes, or just like regular people. How do common people view this ruling class or system of government? Do people have faith in it if it's a monarchy, or there's some sort of other like ruling person or family? How do they view those people? How is propaganda disseminated amongst like average people? How does it affect them and their views? Next is education. This could also tie into propaganda. So you want to think about the levels of education when people start, what they learn. Do most people go to higher education if that exists in this world? Like, do people go to university? Do they have to pay for it? What sorts of things would they study, and how is that determined? Like, who gets in? Do they have to take a test? What jobs are available to them after this? Is it like class locked, like tuition is so expensive that most people probably can't go if they're just like a common working class person? Is education maybe tied to religion? So is there like religious schooling? Who runs these education systems? Who becomes an educator and why? And how might that affect what they teach people? Sorry, can you tell that I am primed to get my master's in education, because I've been thinking about this a lot. Next is travel and views of other cultures. So is travel to other regions accessible to this person? Travel might be more accessible if they're living in like a very trade heavy city, like at the center of a bunch of different trade routes, or maybe like on the docks somewhere? Are they generally accepting of outsiders, or are they sort of wary or just not sure? What ideas might they hold about people from different groups or countries? Or again, if they're living in this like very trade heavy, trade central, then they might meet a lot of different people. They might speak a couple of languages, or at least like know a few phrases in different languages. Next would be law enforcement, crime, and punishment, which is another aspect of politics that I did not really get into. I feel like I'm gonna have to make another video. So how strong-armed is the law in this land? How much do people like respect the written law? I feel like in every sort of, maybe I'm telling on myself, pretty much everywhere you go, there's gonna be some laws that people kind of ignore and some laws that are taken much more seriously. And that's usually sort of cultural. Like for example, the speed limit. Californians, that doesn't exist to us. That's not a real law. It's only a real law if a cop is in view. But murder, that is a real law. That is one that most people are going to follow. From there, you want to think about law enforcement. Like, how do people interact with law enforcement in their day-to-day life? How do they deal with them? How do they view them? I think a lot of this is going to stem from people's like fear. How much do people fear the consequences of criminal activity? How strong is the punishment for criminal activity? Do you get like a day in the stocks and people throw tomatoes at you, or do you get beheaded for stealing a loaf of bread? There's just a scale of different punishments, and honestly, the level of punishment is pretty much arbitrary as well. Another thing to consider are the negative aspects of daily life, such as disease, war, poverty, potential famine or other resource shortages, oppression, harmful cultural values such as like racism, homophobia, sexism, fear, like ambient anxiety about the state of the world or the state of your nation. Like if you are fully aware that your king kind of sucks and is running your country to the ground, probably kind of nervous about it. That's probably a negative aspect of your daily life. These are just a few areas of daily life to consider, but there is definitely a lot more that you can play with here. I think it's just a really interesting exercise to, again, just sort of ground yourself in this world. So now that we're done and clear with this video, which thank goodness, I just have a couple of final thoughts to share with you guys. My main one is that I just want to reiterate that it is important to understand where you come from and what views you might hold and why about specific political and economic systems. So that's just like a little bit of a note, not even a warning, just a note. There's a broad range of life experiences to draw from. In a similar vein, think about and research systems that you are not familiar with or you've maybe never heard of. Again, we kind of write what we know, or that's sort of what we default to, but there doesn't need to be a monarchy in every fantasy story. I just don't think it's necessary. There's so much more out there to consider and explore and play around with. It's just, you know, a matter of approaching maybe different ways of life. Again, sensitively and with like grace and logic, you know, and not letting your biases cloud your judgment. Like I said, I have that list that I found of 36 different types of government. They even had one that was specifically like ruled by magical people, magiocracy or something, which is so funny and cool to me because that is totally a thing you see in fantasy again and again, and I've never seen it like defined in that way. I have, as always, included a list of the different articles and resources I parsed to make this video. Next time, part 5, we'll be talking about religion and magic and that sort of thing, so stay tuned. Hopefully I will complete that video a little bit faster than I completed this one. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye.